This project starts with 3 pieces of wood, a sheet of 1/8 inch birch plywood, a slab of maple, and this ugly warped piece of rough sawn walnut that's been sitting in my garage for years. Somehow, all these are going to become a dice tower. Let's get to work. Before we can build anything, we need to clean up this walnut. First stop is the joiner to give me one flat edge. From there, it's over to the table saw where I'll rip it down to about 3.5 inches wide, which will become the height of the box. Keeping that jointed edge against the fence gives me 2 nice parallel edges. The problem is, this board is still pretty ugly. It's got a decent cup in it, so it's back to the joiner, cup side down. After a few more passes, it's finally flat enough to work with. This may not look real pretty, but it's actually exactly what I want. I've got 2 parallel edges, and one of these sides is perpendicular, giving me 2 90-degree corners. The rest will be done over the table saw, where I'll need to split these boards into 2 thinner pieces. I could technically do this with 2 full depth passes on the table saw, flipping the board halfway through, but that's a lot of material for the blade to remove all at once. Instead, I'll sneak up on it with a few shallow passes before flipping the board over to finish the same cut. Gets me the same result, it's a whole lot less stressful, and honestly, just a cut I'm more comfortable making. These boards are getting pretty thin now, and I still need to plane them to the same thickness, but they're a little too thin for my planer to grab onto. A little double-sided tape on a scrap board solves that problem. It raises everything just enough for the planer to do its job. A few passes later, I've got 4 boards that are all consistent and about 1/8 of an inch thick. Now it's time to figure out the size of the box. I know I want one side to hold 2 complete sets of dice, so I'll lay everything out and see how much room they actually take up. Works out to about 8 inches. I like the proportions of a box that's roughly twice as long as it is wide, so I settled on a width of around 4.5 inches. With those dimensions figured out, I can head back to the table saw with my crosscut stud and cut everything to length. Now for the joinery, and don't expect anything fancy. I'm using simple butt joints where the end grain of one board gets glued to the face of the other. They're quick, they're easy, and they're not especially strong, but don't worry, we'll come back and fix that later. The plywood is going to become the top and bottom of the box, so I need to cut dados into each side piece. Since these walls are already pretty thin, I'm going to lower the blade so it's barely sticking out. I only want to remove about half the thickness of the wood. One pass in the table saw gives me a groove that's a perfect fit for the plywood, 1/8 of an inch. With those cut, I can measure the panels, including the depth of the dados, and cut the top and bottom pieces to size. Before everything gets glued together, I'll give all these pieces a quick sanding. It's way easier to do that now than try to sand the inside of a finished box later. I'll also soften the edges of the plywood just a little so everything slides together a bit easier. Then it's time for the glue up. While that dries, let's shift over to the dice holder. This part is actually pretty straightforward. I'll cut a piece of maple that'll fit inside the box, then glue 2 strips together so it's wide enough to hold 2 complete sets of dice. As that dries, I'll lay out the dice, mark where each one should sit, and draw a simple grid to keep everything lined up. Over at the drill press, I'll use a Forstner bit to drill shallow pockets for each die. I don't want to drill all the way through though, just deep enough so that every die has its own little place. The Forstner bit leaves a flat bottom, but it's not exactly pretty. To dress it up a bit, I'm mixing up some 2-part epoxy with black and copper pigment and pouring just a little bit into the bottom of each hole. "24 hours later, I can come back and meticulously add these little tiny gold labels for each die. One final layer of clear epoxy locks everything in place while still leaving plenty of room for the dice to sit comfortably. Now that the box is dried, we can go back and strengthen those butt joints that we talked about earlier. The other downside to this type of joinery is that you can see the exposed dado cut at each corner. Luckily, I can fix both problems at the same time. By cutting a shallow slot across each corner exactly where that dado is and gluing in a spline, which is just a thin strip of wood, I can hide those exposed dados while adding a lot more glue surface to the joint. This is going to make it a lot stronger and a lot better looking. To cut the splines, I'm using a simple jig that holds the box at a 90-degree angle while it passes over the blade. I'll glue them in using some scraps of the same plywood from the top and bottom of the box so everything starts to get tied together nicely. Next up, the dice tower. Just like everything else in this build, I'm keeping it pretty straightforward. The dice holder takes up about half the width of the box, so the tower's going to get the other half. I'll cut the pieces from the leftover walnut, glue them together with more butt joints, and use a hole saw to create the opening where the dice will roll out. At the top, I'm using another small piece of maple held in place with the dados just like we did on the main box. I also made this little maple ramp for the bottom. Both sides are beveled at 45 degrees to give the dice something to bounce off of before it rolls out of the front. Then, watch me try to glue this thing. Then, it's just a matter of gluing it all together. Once everything dries, I can drill the opening in the top where the dice will drop into the tower. Perfect. Now it's back to the main box, and it's finally time to cut off the lid. I'll position my fence so that every cut falls evenly between the splines, keeping things nice and even. We'll make 4 passes around the box, and just like that, the lid comes free. This is also the exact moment I realized I made a mistake. My original plan was to install hinges. The problem is these walls are just too thin. I could have tried to force it, but I didn't think it would hold up very well. So, welcome to Plan B. Instead, I'm going to build a lid that lifts off and slips over the outside of the box, kind of like a shoebox. I've never built one like this before, but I actually think it might end up being the better design. Using the thicker leftover walnut and maple, I'll miter the corners to get a little bit fancier, and glue everything together, kind of like a frame around the lid. Surprisingly, it worked. Functionality, it was exactly what I wanted. Visually, though, it looked pretty chunky. So, back to the table saw. I'll trim everything down to about 1/4 of an inch thick. To finish it off, I'll add alternating walnut and maple spines around each corner, as I really like how those turned out in the box. Every time I looked at this lid, though, it just felt unfinished. If I were an artist, I'd paint or draw something really neat here, but sadly, my talents lie elsewhere. Then I remember the dice holder, the epoxy, the colors, the way it all came together. There comes a moment in every great adventure where a hero must take a leap of faith. This was mine. I mixed up another batch of epoxy using the same black and copper pigments from the dice holder. And with the courage of a man with both nothing and everything to lose, I began pouring it into a perfectly good lid, knowing failure wouldn't just ruin the lid, it would erase hours of work. As the resin slowly spread across the surface, it swallowed the plywood like a dark tide. Streams of copper drifted through it like rivers of molten lava, and for a brief moment, time itself seemed to stand still. The battle was far from over. Seeing the opportunity, I reached for the gold epoxy, carefully drizzling it over the top in hopes of tying it back into the gold accents that lie inside the box. Armed with nothing more than a stick, I began shaping the swirling patterns. Every movement mattered. Too little, it would look boring. Too much, I'd have a muddy mess. There's no undo button now. Only destiny. Came out great. The next day, after everything had cured, I added a chamfered edge around the lid to give it a little bit more depth before sanding the entire project to 220 grit. Then it was time for the finish. Lately, I've been reaching to tung oil more and more. It's a natural oil that's pressed from the seeds of the tung tree, and unlike finishes that sit on top of the wood, it soaks in and actually becomes part of the wood. I really like the look it leaves behind. It's not overly glossy, it's not plastic looking. It just makes the wood look like better wood. The other reason, every project spends hours looking dull, dusty, and honestly pretty darn disappointing. When the oil touches the wood, it just comes alive. The walnut gets darker, the maple starts to glow. Every grain line you spent hours shaping suddenly starts to introduce itself. It's one of those little things that never gets old, no matter how many projects I build. The oil gets applied with a foam tip brush, it's allowed to sit for a bit, and it's wiped off with a clean cloth. When the finish is dry, all that's left are the little details. I line the inside with brown felt to give the box a cleaner, more finished look. A little spray adhesive and press everything together in place, and that's done. Finally, my signature. Most people never see it, but every project I finish gets one. That's just my way of saying, this one's done. Overall, this project ended up being a collection of a lot of small little details. None of them were especially difficult on their own, but each one added a little something to the final piece. From milling the lumber, to the splines, to the epoxy, every step built on the last one until it finally all came together. And honestly, I'm really happy with how it turned out. The contrast between the walnut and the maple is exactly what I was hoping for. The splines add just enough detail without stealing the spotlight, and somehow that last minute switch to the lift-off lid ended up being one of my favorite parts of the entire build. The lid fits perfectly, and when you flip it over, it can double as a base for the dice tower. Or if you've got a friend at the table who's tired of chasing dice around the room, it makes a pretty great rolling tray too. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, keep creating, keep crafting, and may all your rolls be nat 20s.